Rab Shlomo Feivel Shustel spoke. So he said over a story. He says, I don't know if it's true, of a developed zog, that there was once this Hasidic bus driver who used to drive kids around in the mountains. And he wasn't so strict about the maximum capacity of his bus being 55 students. He would stretch it a little bit. Not much, maybe to 100 students or so. And one day he gets pulled over by the police. And the police says, okay, this bus is certified for 55 people. I'd like to count the students here. So he counted way more than 55 students. And he ticketed the fellow. And the fellow decided he's going to fight him in court. So he goes to the judge. And the police, who's the accuser, says that this fellow was driving a bus that had a capacity of 55 children, and there were over 85 children there. There were 85 children there. So the bus driver says, officer, not officer, your honor, or your worship, or whatever it is that he addressed the judge, it's impossible to get 85 children into this bus. So the officer could say whatever he wants, but I challenge you to bring a school bus here and see how many kids you can physically pack into it. So what the officer is saying is a physical impossibility. So the judge says, okay, you know what? Let's see what happens. So they call to bring a bus into the court parking lot and to bring a swarm of kids, and they start pushing the kids into the bus. When they get up to 70 kids, they're pushing and they're pushing. He couldn't get any more in. So the judge says, okay, you've proven your point. It's physically impossible, and the case dismissed. But then the judge, after he dismisses the case, goes over to the bus driver and says, Ich bin doch auch ein. Look at the damage. What's the do shame? So the bus driver says, in Emerson, I was right. I'm not lying at all. There was no 85 kids in the bus. There was 95 kids in the bus. I willst du wissen how I won the case? It's very, very simple. There's no way you can get so many kids into the bus. How do I get the kids into the bus? It's very simple. When I'm taking the kids, I'm taking them on a trip. They want to go somewhere. I'm a vil food and pack them. But just to push kids into a bus, they won't go. So the line of the night was, I'm a vil food and pack them. How could you have so much time to learn halacha? And how could you have so much time to do whatever else you have to do? So from 516, the answer is, I'm a vil food and pack them. So at the end of the event, Shlomo Goldberg says, I'm going down onto the floor, and you're going to come with me. And he told our group, because we're going to go say Mazel Tov to Abdoven in person. So we get down to security, and there's no way they're letting anybody know unless you have a specific pass that allows you onto the floor. But Shlomo Goldberg, I don't know what he told this guy, but he basically got him to believe that he would probably get fired if he didn't let David's closest friends come in to say Mazel Tov. So I told Shlomo, it's very simple. I'm a vil food and patman. If you want to go, you go. So that's how it is.
That's a different word of Yosy Zalman, because the Schwarzes also say you have to pack it. You know what they mean when you say I'm a vil food and patman.
You're talking about packing
a piece. Yeah.
Okay, beautiful. So I think yesterday we got up to the Gemara that said the reason why Talmid Chacham is allowed to borrow kelim from an Amoritz, even though it's possible that the Amoritz might not have toiled it properly. He might have toiled it in a way where there would be a chetitza. It's because when he borrows it, before he uses it, he's going to toivel it. However, we nevertheless still make pleishetet, which are metal kelim. We still say that they're tamei, even if there was a klicheres that was blocking the tumah from transmitting. And that's because even though technically the Talmid Chacham could borrow that keli and treat it like it's tamei tamas meis and spritz it on Yom Kimmel and Yom Zion, but the problem is normally you don't borrow a pot for 7 days. You borrow it for a day, and therefore it would be impossible for the kohen to deal with such a keli, and therefore we say that these kelim are tamei and you can't borrow them at all. And that's how the Gemara ended off. So we are now up to Vatfila loy mehimni. That is just about half the way down on Daf Chav Beis Amud Beis. The Gemara says Vatfila loy mehimni. Are you telling me that you have to toivel kelim when you borrow them from an am oretz? So are you telling me that they're not believed to toivel things properly? But Tanya we learned nemonin amei haaretz al tahiras tfilas tamimes. They're believed to say that they toiveled after they went through the hazah process of Yom Shlishi and Yom Shvi. Then they have to go to the mikvah, and they're nemon to say they went to the mikvah. So you see, they're believed on tefillah. He's believed to say that he himself toiveled, but he's not believed to say that he toiveled his kelim properly. Rava says, idi bidi bekelev. In fact, it's possible that both of these cases are speaking about his clothing. If he says, I never once toiveled one keli inside another keli. So if he says that, well, then we'll believe him and we'll say that the keli is tahar because it never happened that he was even in a situation where there might be a chatzitza. But Hada Omar hitvalti avalo hitvalti b'chli she'en b'piv kishvei feres hanai. But if he said that I regularly toivel kelim one and the other, but I'm careful to make sure that the hole is open big enough. There we don't trust. It's not a question of trust. We don't rely on the oretz being able to make a proper assessment, and therefore we will not accept those kelim as being taught.
It's almost like we don't. It's almost like we don't accept the Amma Oretz telling us that he's a Talmud Chacham. We keep him as our Oretz.
I hear. Very good. Now that you brought that up, when I finished the two dots, I'm going to speak out something that's a very interesting perspective. Nemon Am Haaretz, and Am Haaretz is believed. Loymar Peiros Loichshu. These pairs that I have, they never came into contact with one of the seven mashkim, and therefore it's impossible for them to become tamei. And therefore, I'm presenting you these pairs as pairs that are tahar. He's believed to say that. These pairs actually did come into contact with water or some other mashkir that's mashkir, but I was careful with them that they shouldn't come into contact with something that's tamei. So you see that there's differences in when we believe the Amoritz. We trust him. It's not like we don't trust him. The question is, do we rely on his expertise to have done things properly? So if he describes a scenario where it's pretty safe, like it was never husher lakabel tuma, or I never even toiveled one keli, another keli, so then we know he was never in the danger zone. However, if he says I was in the danger zone, but I had the expertise to make sure that it's not tamei, that's where we cannot rely on. In fact, the Gemara, do we taka believe him on something relative to his own guf? Like when he said he toiveled, he believed. But Tanya, we learned, we know that when do you get spritz from the paraduma? On the third day after you became tamei, and on the seventh day. So if someone becomes tamei meis, he has to wait for 7 days to become tahar, because he cannot start the tahara process until the third day. So if a Talmid Chacham comes and says, I became tamei 3 days ago, today is day 3, I need to start the process. So the lach is masan olav miyad. You can trust him that today is day 3. But am ha'aretz if an am ha'aretz comes to get spritz from the paraduma water, ein masan olav, you don't believe him or rely on him that today is day 3. Rather, you need to wait and wait 3 days. We have to witness 3 days after the Tumah. So you see, in fact, he's not believed. So when is he believed? When is he not believed? You know why we believe him when he says he toiveled as the last step in the process of being tahar from Tumas Meis? Is because since he knows that we're so strict with him. At the beginning, he can't even come on day 3. He actually has to wait and show us and wait in front of us 3 days. So it's a big hassle to go through this process. Therefore, he called Allah b'soifai. We were makel with him and we trust him when he says he toiveled, because we know in the back of his mind he's going to make sure to do it right, because he doesn't want to have to go through this process again. So Chaim Tzvi was saying something earlier about not letting Amaratzim claim that they're Talmidei Chachamim. So the Tosfos comments on Daf Chav Beis and Aleph, Tosfos comments on what we learned yesterday, that because of Eva, we will trust Amaratzim today to say Eidos, because there's a Shita in the Gemara brought down that the Rabbanan hold that you don't take Eidos, you don't accept testimony from an Amoritz. So he brings down for Al-Khan a very interesting thing. The Kaimelon Rabbi Yossi, since we pass on Rabbi Yossi, that we don't want to alienate and anger Amaratim, that's why you're allowed to bench from Mezuman and include an Amoritz in your Zimun, because you're not allowed to include an Amoritz in Zimun. It's only because of Eva. Even though it says in the Gemara that you're not allowed to include an Amoritz in Zimun, we include Amoratim in Zimun. Why? The only possible reasons of Tosfos is because of Eva. So the Gamar Rabbi Nasha at the Chlifa, there's a story there where Nasha didn't want to include them in the count for Zimun. So it must be, if we do that nowadays, no one ever heard of a restriction about that nowadays, it must be because of Eva. But the Rita is much geschmacker. For even first, you don't have a right to Eva. Because who said you're a Talmud Chacham? Maybe you, who don't want to include Amoritz, maybe you're an Amoritz. Kol HaRoitz Alit, like Kol HaRoitz Alit is a shame, L'Hachzik L'Atzmik Talmud Chacham. Shaloi L'Zaman Ala Amoritz B'Yad Elito. Who do you think you are? You think you're such a big Talmud Chacham that you could say that you're going to exclude somebody else? So it's not because of Eva, it's because who said you're a Talmud Chacham? You might consider yourself a Talmud Chacham, but maybe you're an Amoritz. So like Chaim Tzvi says, you can't just declare yourself as a Talmud Chacham. Who said? Therefore, everybody's allowed with Zimun. Okay, so let's see the Gemara weiter, because we're still.
Are you going to say this? What's his name? Are you going to say this Tosfos in the 9 o'clock shir?
No, because I said it yesterday in the 9 o'clock shir.
Okay, fine.
Zok the Gemara weiter. Achirayim v'toich. So one of the chumras that applies to kachim is even on a tumah derabanan, which they only apply to only a section of a keli. So we normally have different sections in the keli. We discussed if you have a becher that's on a stand, there's the part that you would normally fill with wine, and then if you turned it upside down, the stand is hollow. You'd be able to fill that with wine. There's a handle. There's different parts of a keli. So by tumah deraisa, if it comes into contact with a sheretz, the whole keli is tummy. But by tumas derabanan, it only applies to that specific part of the keli. So achirayim v'toich. So the Gemara wants to know, my achirayim v'toich. What does this mean exactly? So the Gemara kedetan, like we learned in the Mishnah, kli shenitma achirav b'mashkin, a keli that became tummy with a mashkin, and b'mashkin indicates that it has to be a tumah derabanan, because normally a keli could never become tummy from an oichel and a mashka, but there's a gzeira derabanan that a mashka, even though it's only a sheni, will be able to be matama a keli, which normally a keli cannot become anything less than a rishon, but a mashkin will be able to be matama a keli, and it'll make it into a rishon. That's only midirabanan, and they only apply it to parts of the keli. So kli shenit ma'achar b'mashkin, achar of tamein, it's outside of tamei, but toiche, it's inside. Ugnoi, its lip, the lip of a keli, that at the top of a becher, it doesn't stop in a sharp edge, it rolls over. So that point where it rolls over could also contain a little bit of mashka. Or oznoi, its ear, which is a type of a handle. The yodav is a longer handle that you'd find in a different type of keli. Tahirin, because we separate the one keli into its parts. Nitma toichlai, but if the inside became tamei, then kulei tamei, and the whole thing was tamei. Rashi explains to us, why would the Rabbanan make such a weird tumah? Why don't they apply this tumah of tumas mashkin? Why don't they apply it like every other tumah, that it is mitama the whole keli? So that's number one. Number two is, why did they make this tumas mashkin? Why did they invent such a new tumah? If in fact mashka, which is a sheni of a tumah, it cannot be mitama keli, why would they fabricate and make up that it could be mitama keli? So the reason why they fabricated this is because there are a certain type of mashka that could be Matama Keli. In other words, there is a mashka that's considered an avatuma that could be Matama Keli. And what's that? That is any excretion or secretion that came out of a zav or a zava, like the saliva, the urine, anything that comes out of a zav or a zava, any liquid that comes out is a din of an av, and it would be able to make a keli tamei. So since there is a type of mashka that could make a keli tamei, to be careful for that, the Chachamim said that every mashka makes a keli tamei, but since it's a truma d'Rabbanan, there's another peril involved. The halacha is if you have truma that's tamei, you have to burn it. But if you have truma that's not tamei, you're not allowed to burn it. So here they're creating a truma on truma, because if you use this keli that's only tamei midrabanan for truma, so now you're not going to be able to eat that truma anymore, because we're going to say tamei midrabanan. But you're not allowed to destroy this truma either, because it's not really tamei midaraisa. And they were afraid that because of their chumras, people are going to start burning truma unlawfully. So therefore, they created their tumas in an unusual fashion. They gave it weird properties, such as it's only a part of the keli, and therefore people will realize, hey, this is not a normal tumah. What type of weird tumah is it? Oh, it must be d'Rabbanan. Oh, if that's the case, we'll know not to burn truma if truma comes into contact with this. Ubeisat tzvita. The Beisat tzvita was one of the parts of a keli that the Mishnah talked about as an independent part. So my Beisat tzvita, what is the Beisat tzvita? It's a place where you grab onto it when you want to hold it or pass it to somebody. This is a story where Rus came to the field of Boyaz to collect the matnasanim, and he gave her roasted kernels. And the word to describe Boyaz reaching out to her to give her these roasted kernels was vayitzpat, because he grabbed onto it and then he extended it to her. It's this means if you have somebody, when he eats his supper, he likes to eat it out of a TV dinner tray, because he doesn't want to get the coleslaw mixed into the meat, and he doesn't want the ketchup to bleed into the coleslaw. So because of that, he has little compartments. In this case, it means like one compartment in the center of his plate that's sectioned off based on the construction of the plate, so that his ketchup won't bleed into the rest of the food, or his vinegar or whatever condiments he used will not bleed into the rest of the food. So that also has a status of a separate keli. Tani Rabibi Kamed Rav Nachman. Rabibi learned from the name of Rav Nachman. Kol hakelim ein lahem acharayim v'toich. All kelim, we consider them as one big keli. We don't separate them into their own components. Rather, if one part becomes tamei, the entire keli is tamei. Echad kotchei hamikdash, tai kotchei hamikdash, ve'echad kotchei gvul. And tai kodeshim that are into the diaspora, everywhere else. So the question is, what is the Brisa referring to when it says kotchei gvul? Amarle, kotchei gvul ma'anidu. What is kotchei gvul? Kotchim that's in private premises that aren't necessarily in the base of mikdash. So from where truma, it must be referred to truma, which means that even for truma, you don't separate the parts of the keli. Rather, if one part became tamei, it's all tamei. But that's not consistent with our Mishnah. But now nacharayim v'toichav etzitfitol truma. So Gemara, you're right. So when the Brisa says echad kotchei hamikdash v'echad kotchei gvul, maybe what kotchei gvul means is dilma lechulun shenasu al taharas hakodesh ka'amrit. Maybe what it means is chulun shenasu al taharas hakodesh, which we learned earlier that chulun shenasu al taharas hakodesh is treated just like kotchim in many ways, and therefore the whole keli becomes tamei when you're dealing with chulun shenasu al taharas hakodesh. So once the Gemara offered this teretz, so I believe Bibi said, or Rav Nachman said, now you're reminding me, Atkra and Milsa, you just reminded me something, the Omer Rabba Baravua, which we actually learned already. And he said, Achas Esrei Milas Shanu Kan, our Mishnah lists off 11 different milas of Kachim over Truma. So this must be going according to Rava, who learns that the case of Kelim Techeli is not because of Echatzitza. So Sheish Rishonos, the first 6 cases in the Mishnah, which includes this halacha of that for kachim, if one part of the keli becomes tamei, the whole keli is tamei, is bein lekodesh, bein lechulin shenas al taras hakodesh. It applies even to chulin shenas al taras hakodesh, as the Brayso said earlier, Koche Gvul. And Achreinos, the last 6 chumras that the Mishnah discusses, applies to Kodesh of a loy lechulin shenasu al Harsafid. So, for instance, Revi Latuma, which applies to Kachim, that's one of the final 5 in the Mishnah, and that would not apply to Kachim to Chulun shenasu al Harsafid. Dr. Morbaiter, Hanoise es hamedrus. If someone carries a medrus, noise is a truma. So what we said is that in one hand you're holding the shoe of a zav or a zava, which makes you into an avatuma, and in the other hand you have truma. It's in a sealed cheres container. You're not physically touching it, and therefore it remains tahar. But if it was kachim inside, you wouldn't be allowed to carry it. Now it doesn't say if it becomes tamei or not. No, it just says noise is a truma of a lois to kodesh. You're not allowed to carry kodesh, but it doesn't say what will happen to the kodesh if you did. And the Gemara is going to flush that out at the end. Zoktamer kodesh my time aloi. What's the problem with carrying kachim in another hand if it's protected in a cheres container? It's kryptonite. Zoktamer mishumaisi shahaya. Because there was a story that specifically happened with kachim, and because of that, we made the gzera only by kachim. Once upon a time, he was transporting a jug of wine that belonged to the Beis Hamikdash of kachim. And what happened? And as he's walking, the strap of his shoe tore. Now, apparently, he was a zav, or the shoe that he was wearing had become tamei because the zav had stepped on it. So he took the strap off. The notla, he took the strap because he didn't want to lose it. He wanted to sew it back on when he got home. And he put it on top of the jug. Not a problem, because a chavis will only become tamei if the tumah gets inside it. This is just sitting on top of it. And then what happened is v'nopla la'avir chavis, and by mistake it fell into the airspace of the chavis. V'nitmas. Now that made the chavis tamei, and it made all the wine tamei. So it created a big problem. It messed up a whole jug of wine. The Oysa Shah at that time, to avoid something like this happening in the future, after they had the inquest, Amru, they said, "Hanoise as a medras, noise as a truma." Somebody who's carrying medras in one hand can carry truma that's in a sealed cheres container in the other hand. Avoloy a kodesh, but he cannot do it by kodesh. Frank the Gemara, ihachi truma nami. This chashash can equally occur with truma as it can with kodesh. So why do we only apply the gzeira to kodesh and not to truma? So tomorrow Hamani Rab Chananya ben Akavyahi, because we're following, our mission is following the shita of Rab Chananya ben Akavya. When they make a gzeira, they don't make the gzeira on everything. They only apply the gzeira to the very specific case that it happened with. So even though logically you might want to say, well, this same concern applies not only in the specific case that it happened, let's analyze and see what else might be impacted, and therefore let's spread the gzeira. Zakr b'chananya, we don't do that. We only make a gzeira for a very specific case. And since the case that we're talking about occurred with kachim, the gzeira not to carry it together with medras is only by kachim. It would not apply to truma. So we're referring to some other case that they made the gzeira only in the yard, only in a ship, and only if it had occurred exactly as the original problem occurred. So Mai, what is that story? The Tanya, lo yisa adam mechatas, there's a rule. One may not carry the water of the paraduma, the eferchatas, or the earth of the paraduma, the avirim biyarden. He's not allowed to transport them on the Jordan River, uvesvina, in a ship. But not only can't you do that, you're not allowed to transport the ingredients of the mechatas across the river, even if you're throwing it from one side to the other. You're not allowed to cross a river with this eferchatas. You're not allowed to let them float across the water. You're not even allowed to ride a behema while you're carrying these things. Or be on your friend's shoulders while you're carrying these things. Unless your feet are on the ground. If you're on a ship, you're floating. Your feet has to be grounded, the person who's carrying it. So that's a rule that's much more encompassing. You are allowed to go across a river if you're walking on a bridge because your feet are on the ground on the floor of the bridge. And Echad Yarden, this is not a gzer that only applies in the Yarden, it's any body of water. The Echad Shar Naharis. So this is the Shita of the Tanakama, who holds that when you make a gzera, you do analyze where this could occur, and you don't just pinpoint the exact circumstances for your gzera. Rather, you spread the gzera to any relevant case. Like Reb Chananya ben Ekadu, no. We only ask you to carry the Efer Achatos and the Mayim of the Paraduma is like Asr Ela B'Yarden Ubestvina Uvamaisha Shaya. Only under the exact circumstances in which the problem occurred. And what were those exact circumstances? And what was the problem? Maisha Shahaya. What occurred that prompted this Gezerah? There was a person, he was transporting the Paraduma water in the Yarden, and he happened to be in a ship. And you know what happened? They found a piece of a mace on the boat, which created an oil mace throughout the boat, and now the Afer of the Paraduma became Tamei, which means it's no longer effective. So Zakta Gemara, to avoid such a scenario, Amru, they said, a person should not carry any component of the Paraduma, water or ashes, and he should not transport them in the Yarden, bistvina, in a ship. So Reb Chananya learns that only that exact circumstance did they outlaw. Even though what's the difference between the Yarden and any other body of water, or what's the difference if it's a ship or if he's walking on the shoulder of somebody else? So the Chumma said you look at any similar case and you spread a larger umbrella to create Isser for the Gzeira. Reb Chananya says you stick strictly to what occurred. So going back to our case, that's why it's only by Kodesh where you're not allowed to have kachim in one hand and have medrash azav in the other hand, because the problem that happened, even though it could have equally occurred with Truma, it only occurred with Kodesh, and that's where we make our Gzeira. Now the Gemara wants to know, Iboilu, Sandal Tomei, Sandal Tahar Mahu. The Gzeira was that the Gzeira only to have in one hand a sandal, a shoe that is tamei. What if the shoe is tar on the other hand? Did they say the gzeira applies even to any shoe, not just the shoe that was tamei? Or chavas psucha, chavas tumamau? Is the gzeira only if the jug was open, so it's possible for the tumah to fall into the jug? Or maybe they asked for any jug, even if it was sealed, and it would be protected from anything falling into it. Or avar v'nasa. It says in our Mishnah that you're not supposed to carry Tumah in one hand and kachim in the other hand. But what if you did do it? Does it become Tamei? Does it passel it? Or do we say it's b'di'evet, it's tahar? Ma, what would the halacha be? Rabbi Ila Amar, im over v'nasa Tamei. Rabbi Zeir Amar, over v'nasa tahar. So it's actually machlokes if one violated this gzeira of the chachamim and one did carry Tumah in one hand and in the other hand he had kachim in a sealed container of cheres. The machlokes if we say that it's possible now and that kachim cannot be eaten, or do we say it's tar? Okay, the next layer was when kalim become complete, that's when they can be mekabel tumah. Before they're complete, they're not able to be mekabel tumah. So if you had kalim that were completed with tahara, which means they're not tamei, for truma you could just use them for truma because they're tahar kalim. But if they're being used for kachim, then you have to toivel them anyway. The Gamrinu Man. The question is, who completed the keli? Who was there when the keli transitioned into a position where it could become tamei? Ilema de Gamrinu Chaber. If the person that completed them was a Talmud Chacham, well then lamalu tvila. Why would you have to toivel them? They're perfectly tahar kelim. Because the chaver would have been very careful to make sure that once completed, these kelim will not come into contact with tumah. Ella the gemrinu amaretz. It must be that who was the person who completed the kelim? It was an amaretz, and therefore we're afraid it became tumah after the fact. Frank the Gemara, nigmorin v'tahara karilei Karilahu. The Mishnah is referring to kelim that were completed with tahara. If they were completed by an amoritz, that wouldn't be considered nigmorin b'tahara, because an amoritz completing them actually puts them in grave danger of becoming tamei. Amar Rabbi Bar Shila, Amar Rab Masna, Amar Shmuel, la'olam degamrinu chaver. It's speaking where a Talmid Chacham completed the kelim. So if that's the case, why do we need to table them? What's the concern? We should see noira dama oritz the nafal. We're afraid that saliva sprayed out of the mouth of an amoritz and landed on the keli. Frankly, more the nafal amos. When did the saliva fall on this keli? If it was before the keli was completed, well, there's not a problem. Halav manahu. At that point, even the saliva of an amoritz, even if it was a zov, it's surely tamei. It won't be matame the keli because the keli is not yet a keli, so it wouldn't become tamei. Alabasa de gamri. So what are you going to suggest? That after the Talmid Chacham completed the keli, at that point, saliva of the amoritz got on it? That's impossible, because at that point, the Talmid Chacham is watching the keli like a hawk to protect it from becoming tamei. Mizer zahar b'hu. He would make sure that this wouldn't occur. So to Gemara, la'olam mekamei de gamri. We're concerned that saliva of an amoritz got onto the keli while the Talmid Chacham wasn't watching, wasn't being careful, because it wasn't a keli yet, and it was not in danger of becoming tamei. But we're concerned the dilma be'idin de gamri adayin lachavi. We're afraid that the saliva was still there and hadn't dried up yet by the time the Talmid Chacham finished the keli, and then it will be mitamei the keli. And that's the gzeira. That's why for kodesh, even if it's kelim and nignomar but tahira, you have to tovel them again. Zok to Gemara. Normally, if something is tamei, even a keli, and you tovel it, you cannot use it for kachim yet. You have to wait until nightfall. You need harav shemesh. But our Mishnah doesn't mention anything. It just says kelim and nignomar but tahira, kriach and tefillah. And from our Mishnah it's mashma that right after you tovel it, you can use it for kodesh. You don't have to wait for the evening to come. Tefillah in harav shemesh loy. Dr. Gemara, if that's what this tumah does, if that's what this tumah de rabbanan does, is that it says that you have to tovel the keli and then you could use it right away. You don't have to treat it like a regular tumah. Rather, you could just use it right away. This would be inconsistent with what Rabbi Elazar said. It's not we learned in the Mishnah. What would they typically carry around the mei par aduma in? What type of receptacle would they use? They would use like a test tube, but the way they made the test tube is they would cut a a reed down, and the reed is hollow, and I guess they would seal one end of it, and it created like a test tube type of device that they were able to use to put in the mei paraduma. Now, while this reed is growing, it's not mekabel tumah, but the moment you cut it and you make it into a test tube, now it will be the kabel tumah. So you cut down and you created a keli out of this growing plant to use to transport your mechatas. Rabbi Eliezer says you have to tovel it right away. Why? It never became tamei. Why would you have to tovel it? Same question as the question we had on our Mishnah. Rabbi Yeshua says no. Yitma, you purposely make it tamei, the achakach yitma, and only then are you toveling it. So that's a weird thing. Why would you purposely make something tamei? So we need a little bit of background for this. The halacha is that a tvul yoim is allowed to be oisik in the paraduma. So you have somebody who was tamei, and then he toveled. Right now that he toveled, he's not allowed to eat kachim. He's not even allowed to eat truma because he has to wait for nightfall. But he is allowed to be oisik in working with the paraduma. So interesting to note then. So it's a little bit cooler. There's a certain cooler that applies to paraduma water, is that even though you're a tvul yoim, you're allowed to be oisik. The problem is the tzidaikim said that a tvul yoim is not allowed to deal with the paraduma stuff. And therefore, Chazal, in order to illustrate loud and clear that the tzedekah are wrong, would purposely make the kohen into a tvul yoim. They would purposely make him touch tumah, go to the mikveh, and deal with the paraduma that day. So everyone saw loud and clear that the tzaddikim are wrong. Now, because they made that great kula, and they do it with a tefillah yom, they packed on many, many chumras to balance out the tremendous kula that they are blatantly exhibiting to offset. People shouldn't look lightly upon paraduma. But whatever the case is, we always want to use tefillah yom people and tefillah yom kalim when we're preparing the paraduma, because we're trying to really exhibit publicly that a tefillah yom is allowed to be oisik in the paraduma. So that's why Rabbi Shua said, Yitma v'achach yitma, you purposely make it tummy, just like you do to the kohen himself, who's being oisik in the paraduma. So this particular reed that was cut down, that was made into a test tube to carry the May paraduma, the chatchaman, who was the person who actually cut it off the ground? If it was a Talmud Chacham who cut it, lama litvila. Why, according to Rabbi Eliezer, do you have to be yitbal miyad? You shouldn't have to toil it. It never became tamei. If you're going to tell me that an amaretz cut it, if an amaretz cut it, we consider it tamei because we consider an amaretz tamei. So Baha, Lema Rabbi Yeshua, Yitma v'Yitpoil, why did Rabbi Yeshua say you have to purposely go and make it tamei in order to toivel it? If it was cut by an amaretz, we already consider it tamei. How tamei v'koi? It already is tamei. Lama Rabbi Bar Shila Amar Rav Masna Amar Shmuel. And the Rabbi Bar Shila Bar Masna Amar Shmuel, which is the same Mefarish that was Mefarish our Mishnah this way, he's Mefarish the Brisa this way as well. That the Keli was cut down by a Talmud Chacham. So there really is no chashash that it became tamei. So why are we requiring? Why is Rabbi Eliezer requiring a tvila on this newly formed test tube? We're afraid, we're afraid that an amaretz is live fell on it. So the lafal, when did it fall? If it happened before it was cut down, at that point it was still mechubar lakarka, it was still a growing plant. Halav manahu, it couldn't become tamei. Elamai, what are we afraid? That the saliva of the amaretz fell on it after it became a keli? Mizar Zarba, a Talmud Chacham that was handling this item, would never allow that to occur. So the question is, according to Rabbi Eliezer, why is it that he says you have to toivel this newly formed receptacle, this newly formed keli? So we're afraid that saliva got onto it while it was still mechubar lakarka, but we're afraid when the person cut it down and made it into a keli, maybe the saliva is still potent and it'll make it tummy. So basically, it's the same gzeir that we have in our Mishnah. So let's think. Bishlam Rabbi Yeshua. According to Rabbi Yeshua, it makes sense why you have someone specifically make this tamei, because you want everyone to know that this was a tefillah yom. In this activity, we're showing clearly that the tzaddikim are wrong because you're making something tamei and then you're tabling it and you're using it that day. The Tnan we learned, the kohen who was going to be dealing with the paraduma, before he did it, they actually went and touched him with a sheretz. They actually made him tamei. Why? Of course, the kohen then went to the mikveh, and after he went to the mikveh, he started working with the paraduma, even though he was still at tefillin. Why? The tzaddikim used to say that only people who are already rated till the evening, only they're allowed to deal with the paraduma. But you cannot deal with the paraduma after you went to the mikveh, but before the end of the day. So we show every time that that's not true. The kohen actually is now tefillah yom, and he's dealing with the Ephra paraduma. Elo Rabbi Eliezer, according to Rabbi Eliezer, where we were not metama this reed, we required tvila because it is chashash, but we're not doing any ma'aseh blatantly to show that this is tamei. Elo Rabbi Eliezer, if you learn that in a normal case, when a Talmud Chacham finishes making a keli, we toivel the keli, and then we need to wait until nightfall before the keli could be used. So then there's a distinction between a normal keli and a keli that's being used for the paraduma. Because a normal keli, when it's completed because of this chashash, the saliva, we say it needs to be toiveled and it needs harav shemesh. But under the same circumstances, for the Mei Paraduma, we allow it to be used even before nightfall. So that also shows that today we're wrong because we're treating this Tuma differently by Paraduma than we are in any other case. But if you're going to learn like we were just medayik, that you don't need Harav Shemesh at all, this rule that Kalim and the Gemara B'Tahara need tefillah for Kodesh, but right after the tefillah could be used by every Kalim, so then my Kalim Tzedakah. So then there's nothing different that we're doing with the Keli that we're using for the Paraduma, nothing different between that and what we would do with any other Keli. So there's nothing here to show, to demonstrate that we're using Kalim that are Tefillah. So therefore we're going to have a big problem because we need to have some function to happen here that indicates that this is a Tful Yoim and we're still using it for the Paraduma. So Amar the Rav answered, we still have that, nothing to worry about. We still have a very good hecker. Why? Because Asua Kitame Sheretz. Normally there's a halacha that you have to toivel kalim that are brand new kalim, like it says in our Mishnah. But they're only a sheni l'tuma. It's a very weak tuma midrabanan. But by the paraduma, when they cut it down, when someone cuts down a reed to use as a test tube to carry the mei paradumin, there they gave it a higher level of tuma. There they actually made it into a rishon. So that's a much more severe tuma. And since it's a much more severe tuma, and whenever something becomes a rishon, that normally would require harav shemesh, but by the case of the paraduma, they're not requiring that. That makes the point, that exhibits that even the tefil yoim can be used for the paraduma. Zok the Gemara, elamayata lo sit ma'adam. So if you're telling me that the level of tuma that this reed has, that you made into a keli, is only the level of tuma of a rishon, because it's like a touch to sheretz. But so then, if that's the case, if a person touched it, a person wouldn't become tummy, because we know that the lowest level of tumah that a person can contract is a rishon, which means he would have to touch an av to become a rishon. But if we're saying that this reed itself is a rishon, then anyone touching it would not become tummy from this reed. Allah Matanya, why did we learn? The person who cut it down and toiveled it, he himself needs to do tefillah, which means he himself became tummy. If he himself became tummy, it means that this reed that was cut must be an av and not a rishon. So what is the tumah that the Chachamim put on this keli? No, they made this reed into an av. Someone who touches a mace is an avatuma, because the mace is avia voice, and when you touch the mace, you become an av. So we're treating this keli as if it's an avatuma. And therefore, the person who touches it becomes a rishon, and therefore the person would have to toivel as well. If the Chachamim are making this keli as if it touched a mace, well then tefillah is not enough for it. Anything that touched a mace needs hazah shlishi ushvi, and clearly this doesn't need that. Allah matanya chotra umadvila, ton tefillah. It says you need tefillah, but tefillah in hazah shlishi ushvi loy. You don't need hazah shlishi ushvi. So how could you say they made it like a tummy mace? Dr. Gemara, a fabulous chiddush. They gave this keli the status of a tummy mace on the seventh day after it already had the second zrika, but before it had the tefillah, which is a very, very interesting scenario. So the Rashash builds from here a phenomenal chiddush. And he says as follows: there's a halacha cherev hareu k'chalal, meaning if a keli touches a mace himself, if a keli touches a mace himself, the keli itself becomes like the mace, and therefore it becomes like an avia voice atuma. And if a person touches it, now the person becomes an avatuma. However, he says that when you contract tuma from something, and he brings rise from Gemaras, if you touch something and you become tummy from that thing, you will not be able to be more tummy than the thing that transmitted the tumah to you. So if something that you touch has a permanent tumah, well then your tummy, well, it's going to be permanent until you toivel. But if you touch something that doesn't have a permanent tummy, for instance, you touch something that you touch something that became tummy from a mace, but it no longer requires rika. Why doesn't it require rika? Because it already had this rika, because you touched a keli that touched a mace. This keli already had a zah shlishi, already had a zah shvi. Now all this keli is missing is tefillah. So if you touch it, you don't contract more tumah than it itself has. And therefore you yourself would also be able to toivel tonight, and you wouldn't need any type of hazah at all. Tanya, we learned, how can you say such a thing? These are massive chiddush. It's a new type of tumah that you say the person's like a tummy mace, but a tummy mace on the seventh day. It's a very new, innovative type of tumah. We learned that even though the Chachamim made many chumras regarding the Parah Aduma, but they only made chumras about things that are tumas that exist, but they will never make up a new type of tumah. And here, fabricating a new type of tumah, like you're like a tummy mace on the seventh day, that's a very new thing, and we don't do that normally by Parah Aduma. Rabbi, that's not what it means. What it means, they're not machadish it. Yishaloi omru kurdim metama moshev. The halacha is anything that you could sit on could become tamei machus moshev from sitting, but something that you normally wouldn't sit on, like an axe, no one sits on axes, that could not become tamei tumas moshev. So that's what they meant. Tumas mace is something that's there, so they're taking a version of tumas mace. But to put tumah on something that has no shaykhah to that type of tumah, that's what they would not do when it comes to the Parah Aduma. Tanya, like we learned in the Brisa, there's a Yoshev ala kli. If you sit on a keli that a Zav sat on, you'll become tummy. In other words, when a Zav sits on a keli, he makes the keli tummy. Yochel kafasa v'yoshev aleh. You might think that if you took a keli that's made to measure produce with, so it's a tool, and you sat on it, or tarkiv, or you took another measurement for Yoshev aleh and you sat on it, ye tamei. You might think you'll be tamei. Imagine you're on the construction site, and they have those 5-gallon tubs that you buy from Home Depot, and they're going to be using it to mix cement with, to mix paint with. And you're on site, you grab that bucket, you turn it over, and you sit on it like a stool. You might think it'll be tamei. Only if you sit on something that's designed to be sat on. Something that's designed to be sat on, that can become tamei machus moshev. If you're sitting on that Home Depot bucket on their work site, the workers are going to say, "Sir, can you please stand up? We need that bucket to mix the paint with." So clearly the bucket is not something that's made to sit on, therefore the bucket could not contract tumah from being sat on, because it's not something that's supposed to be sat on. That's something where Chazal wouldn't put tumah on by Parah Aduma, because that would be adding tumah to something that's not even in the category of having that tumah. Okay, let's just leave another couple of lines. We're almost there. Hakli mitzaref ma'ashe b'soichoy l'kodesh avaloy l'shuma. We know hanamili. How do we know this? Amar pchanin to Amar kra. So we said if you have a keli that has multiple pieces of meat in it, if a sheretz touched one of the pieces of meat, they're all considered like one big piece of meat, and they're all tummy. How do you know that? Amar kra kaf achas asorazov melei ketayros. It says in the pasuk kaf achas asorazov melei ketayros. It's kaf achas. Whatever is in the kaf is achas, it's considered one piece. Rabbeinu Chanana learns a little differently. It says kaf. Kaf is in singular form. So why does it have to say kaf achas? That's an extra word to tell you that everything inside it is tahar. Is one, and it will become tummy. If tummy touches one piece, everything's tummy, which is interesting because that means that this is a deraisa. It's not a chomer d'rabbanan. We're learning out of a pasuk. The Torah says that anything that's in a vessel is one piece, and therefore, if tumah touches even one piece of meat in the pot, all the other pieces are tummy. Mother of Kahana, Rabbi Kiva added on to the Gzeir d'Rabbanan, Hasoilas, Vakatoris, Valavina, Vagachalim. Shem Nagat, Full Yoim, Bibit Sasai, if it's Full Yoim touched one part of these things, Pasalas Kuli, they all become tummy. So you see Vahad Rabbanani. You see clearly that this is a Gzeir d'Rabbanan, it's not a deraisa from a pasuk. Mimai, how can I prove that it's a d'Rabbanan? Vidakatani Reisha, what did Rabbi Kiva say? In addition to what you're talking about, I'm adding Silas Kataris Levine and Gechalim to the category. But what was the original halacha of the bishop? It was Heid Rabbi Shimon ben Meseir al Efer Chatas Shenaga Tamei b'Miktzasa Shetime Eskulai. if you have Efer Chatos, that someone tummy touched part of it, it's all tummy. And on that, that's Xera. That has to be Xera. Why does Efer Chatos have to be Xera? Because Efer Chatos cannot even become tummy. Because the pasuk of Kaf Achas Asar Zov Melech Teres is speaking about Kodshim. If we have any type of Makor that everything is considered referring to Kodshim, it's definitely not referring to Efer Chatos. So by Efer Chatos, surely it's only a Durabanan, and on that it says V'ktani Hoitzev Kiva, meaning it's all Durabanan. So how could you suggest the Makor is a pasuk? Amr Shlachis Mishlu Bakapora, the Shlachis said in the name of Bakapora, like Nitzrucha Ele L'Shiyare Mincha Dairaisa. I'm sorry, you're right. Shiyare mincha is what we're referring to, but really it's all the Rabbanon. In other words, Shiyare mincha, that in fact would be only the Rabbanon. So let's see what the rules are. Doiraisa, midoraisa, tzarech l'kli akli v'tzarfai. Anything that needs the keli is mitzarfai. So for instance, the mincha itself needs to be placed into a kli sharis. Anything that needs to be placed in the levina have to be placed in position. So anything that needs to be in a keli as part of its process, then a kli mitzarfai, there kaf achas asar zov melech teres applies that midaraisa, it's all one item, and if tumah touches part of it, it's all tummy. But she'ein tzarech l'kli, but the shiyare mincha, which is after you already makriv the kaimitz, the leftover the mincha doesn't have to be in a kli sharis, that gets eaten by the kayanim, that can be in anything. So since it doesn't need it to be in a keli, ain't kli mitzarfei. Midaraisa, it wouldn't be all one piece. The asur rabbanon, the gazru, and the rabbanon made Xera, the afagav they nitzarch l'kli mitzarfei. Even though they don't need to be in a keli because the avodah was done with it, and now it's just yar mincha that's going to be distributed to kahanim. It doesn't have to be in a keli. Nevertheless, with the rabbanon, if tumah touches part of it, all of it is tamei. Okay, let's stop over here. I went a little bit too late, so we'll stop here. Have a wonderful, wonderful Shabbos. And Michem, we're going to learn Matzoi Shabbos at 8:15. Matzoi Shabbos at 8:15, we're going to learn. Have a good Shabbos.
Shabbos.
Shabbos.